Hello, and welcome to our discussion today. It's going to be on initiation, the Khalsa, and the formation of authority. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about initiation in general. We're going to do some religious studies, general theory. Then we're going to talk about the Khalsa and the 5 Ks, and we're going to talk about how that gets molded together into sort of religious authority in Sikhism. And then finally, we're going to apply sort of our theory methodology of initiation from religious studies onto the Khalsa. All right, so first off, what is this thing, initiation? This is sort of like a key element that we need for understanding the Khalsa. So in the Khalsa, someone is initiated. They go through an initiation ritual, and then they are what is known as an initiate. So one of the interesting things to me about initiation is it's a transition point from life before and life after, that there's a space in between, or a liminal spot that we're going to talk about in a minute, and that after you are an initiate, then your life changes. You have to uphold vows, and you have different social understandings, and you have a different relationship to other people who have been initiated. So the term initiate is borrowed from the Latin initiatus and initio, to begin or originate, or initium, a beginning, from inio, to go in, enter upon, or begin. So initiation really has this sense of movement. I want you to get an overall understanding of that. Now, our two big thinkers on initiation and religious studies are sort of anthropologists who are also anthropologists of religion. First is Arnold von Gennep, and the other is Victor Turner. Both of whose works have been really influential, to the point that Joseph Campbell in his Hero of a Thousand Faces borrowed a lot from Van Gennep and his understanding of initiation, which becomes sort of the backbone of the mythology of Star Wars, in fact. I was just reading about Chuck Palahniuk, the guy who wrote Fight Club. I was reading some interviews with him, I don't know, about a year ago. And he was talking about how his biggest influence is the writings of Victor Turner on liminality and initiation. So when we're talking about initiation, and here I have a picture of the Upanayana, which we talked about in Hinduism, when a Brahmin boy gets his sacred cord specifically tied on. So Van Gennep wrote about rites of passage. He was an early 20th century anthropologist. And when we talk about rites of passage, what we're really getting at is these sort of transition periods in someone's life that are accompanied by rituals that sort of helps one move from one stage of life to another. The most important ones we think about are movement from childhood to adulthood, such as going from being just a normal kid to having your sacred cord tied on, and then you're a student. I mean, what's another big one? Graduation from high school, being able to vote, being able to, once upon a time, buy a pack of cigarettes at 18, or buy beer at 21. There aren't rituals there, but there are some other rituals that we can think of. That do exist, like getting a driver's license. There's a whole, like you leave your status as being a passenger, and then you go through education, and then there's a ritual at the DMV where you get your driver's license, then you can drive and your whole life changes. So within understanding rites of passage, we have to understand that there's a threefold status. You have what we call preliminary, then we have the liminary, and the liminal. Now, liminal, we'll talk about this in a second, means threshold, the place in between. And we know this term preliminary, something you do before doing something else. So in a preliminary rite of passage, or a preliminary to a rite of passage, someone is just sort of normal, but they have to be prepared. It's like you're getting prepared for the rite of passage. So then if you go into like an African rite of passage, you would be learning all the things from, your elders and whatnot, but then you enter the rite of passage, the ritual. And in that sense, and Turner will talk about this a little bit more, in this liminary period, that's when you're in the ritual. Now, in the ritual, you might have trials, you might be taught secret things, but when you are in this ritual, there are two key ideas. First is that you are underseeing sort of the eye of an authority. Someone's looking over you and making sure the whole ritual works right. And then also that it is traditional. You don't have a rite of passage without a rite that's handed to you. You have to have the ritual. Think about baptism or christening or profession of faith in Christianity, where you learn all this, then you go into the ritual and you're overseen by someone who's looking over you, but you're also doing it like everyone has done before. Or as say Freemasons or any of the sort of occult groups that I've studied, they all say the power of this is that you're going through what your forefathers did, like in Freemasonry. My grandfather was a Freemason. I've yet to join the Freemasons. I will in the future. But when I was talking to Shriner, who's like kind of a high up Freemason, he said there's a power to the ritual, not that you're going to learn, get magic powers, or not that you're going to join the Illuminati or anything. But what you are going to do is go through exactly what your grandfather went to. I contacted the Masonic organization here, and I was talking to them a little bit about how my grandmother was in the Order of the Eastern Star, and my grandfather was Freemason, and they wrote to me and they invited me to a meeting, and they specifically said your grandparents would be excited and happy that you're advancing on this path into the light. So that's kind of a cool thing. Then you have this sort of post-liminal period. This is when you move into a new status. Whether you're an adult or you're a member of a society like the Khalsa, or you're a member of the Freemasons and you are an established Freemason and you're spending time with your Masonic brethren. So the idea is preliminary, you're different, you're in your earlier stage, you're learning. Then liminary, you're in the ritual, which is a space that is kind of all wide open, but it's under the authority of an authority. And it is a traditional action. And then post-liminal, where you're reintegrated into society, but you're new, and you have a new relationship with the people that have gone through this. This is the exact same thing with the Khalsa. You're a young Punjabi guy, you're in a Sikh family, you learn Gurmukhi, you learn the basic rituals and whatnot, then you go into the Khalsa initiation, you become an Amritdari, you bear the nectar, and then after that, you have a whole new set of vows that you have to maintain, but you're also part of this order of initiates that become Sikh authoritative figures. So in Liminality, which Victor Turner takes from Van Gennep and explains even more, liminality comes from a Latin space, liminar, that means like the threshold, like the spot in a doorway, in between. So what Turner built on when he talked about liminality was to understand what goes on in this space, especially in initiation rites. And he explains that you go from like a structured way of the world, but in the ritual, you're not in society anymore. It's like an anti-structure. It's a crazy space. And he studied specifically the African rituals amongst the Ndembu people. And he showed that this was the space where everything was broken apart. The initiates had nothing to hold on to. They could only learn what they were learning and go through the trials and tribulations, but they didn't have any of the institutions that they had before. And in that time, actually, they built a bond with other people. And I know I've been through some secret initiations in my time that I won't tell you which, but I developed this connection to the people I went through the rituals with that is sort of undying. In Tibetan Buddhism, when someone takes an initiation to do a specific practice, like if you're in Vajrakalaya, he who is the lightning diamond staking one, if you take an initiation into Vajrakalaya, so to do practices for Vajrakalaya, to be empowered to do those practices, if someone is taking that same with you, is sitting next to you, they're then called your Vajra twin. You have this new relationship because you've been through it together. And in these, what they call wangs or initiations in Tibetan Buddhism, you do find that when you're going through them, you develop this odd connection to people. They can be over the period of several days of learning the teachings, various rituals, then initial practices of the rituals. And going through that with someone as you're being taught by a lama who's guiding you along the same traditional path as before, it does really build something. So what are some other initiations we can think of? Well, what about baptism or profession of faith? In my Protestant Calvinist tradition, you have to learn about the Christianity, you have to learn all of this, you have to learn all the whatnot, and then you step and you stay the thing. But then, the minister, the authority, does the tradition of immersing you or drizzling water on your head if you're a Catholic and whatnot. They usually do it at a very young age. And then you emerge from it sort of renewed, a new person in a new community. Or what about ordination? Up here on the left, you see this priest. There's a man being made a priest. So there again, preparation, ritual, and then a change in status. The picture of the guys with the swords, that's a Freemason initiation, and that's one in which they are giving him the initiate knowledge of the light. And they say they're raising another brother up into the light. So he goes through ordeals and they're kind of scary and whatnot, but he learns some things and he has a whole new connection to his brothers. On the right, I have just a yantra, which is a Sanskrit word that means machine. And I wanted to tell you about some tantric initiations. And a lot of the Shaiva tantric initiations, part of it is to figure out the god that or goddess that you will be worshiping specifically, that you're being initiated into doing her practices. You'll be blindfolded, and one takes a flower and throws it into one of these sort of mystic yantras, and wherever it lands, that's the goddess that you're going to do your big set of practices that you're going to be dedicated to for the rest of your life. So these are different forms of initiation. But we're talking about the Khalsa, and we're talking about Sikhism. So in these Khalsas, I did want to make this point, I'm going to make this point over and over and over again in class, that I presented Sikhism last week in very much a way that all Sikhs would like. In this, I'm going to talk about the rituals, but I'm going to show that they aren't the same since Guru Gobind Singh initiated them in 1699. They've changed quite a bit, in fact. And we're going to talk about that, but an Orthodox Sikh would say that they never changed. So we have this Orthodox tale about Guru Gobind Singh. And Guru Gobind Singh gets a whole bunch of Sikhs together, and he puts up this tent. And he walks out of the tent, and he has a sword that he holds high, and he says, "Who is willing to give their head for the Guru and to me?" And nobody says anything, and a guy comes up, and he says, "I will." And they go inside, and they hear and a thump, and the Guru Gobind Singh comes out, and his sword is all bloody, and he says, "Who else?" And everybody's like, "Ah, this is terrifying!" And then another guy comes up, and another guy. So there's 5 of them. And then there's a rustling in the tent. He goes back in, his bloody sword and everything. And 5 come out all dressed in blue and saffron, just like him. And he says, "These are my panch pyare, my 5 most beloved." And they're dressed just as he is. So that's the traditional tale. To some degree, and there's no reason to think that that's not true. But we'll see that that very ritual in which he was probably inside mixing up the nectar and talking to them, it's not exactly like the Khalsa initiation that we read about today in McLeod. Okay, so what I wanted to get at here is another religious studies thing. This is a myth. All the details aren't exactly true historically, but they are true. Myth is a story that does work. We have this idea, like I say, that's just a myth, meaning that's false. But in religion, myth is a story that does work. It doesn't pretend to be historically absolutely valid. Its goal is to give meaning and impart meaning into the person that hears it. So myth is a story that does work. Myth does not mean falsehood. Myth is not a lie. Myth might pretend that it is historically true, but it's more about the story than anything. So I wanted to, as I'd said, most Khalsa Sikhs will argue that what Guru Gobind Singh in 1699 did was exactly what they did when they were initiated. We're actually going to see that that very ritual was only codified and made clear and published so they could do it the exact same way in 1950. Wildsville. Okay, but here's some understanding of some terminology regarding the Sikhs, regarding the initiates, and regarding the 5Ks. Remember, the 5Ks are long hair, the iron bangle, the special underpants that didn't go below the knee, the comb, and finally the knife or sword. Okay, so you have these Sajdaris. And these terms you are going to need to learn. And we're going to get more into who the Sajdaris versus the Amritdaris and the Kishdaris are in our next lesson. So Sajdaris, these are Sikhs who have made a conscious decision not to undergo the initiation into the Khalsa. So these guys are not under Khalsa regulations because they never took the initiations. However, what we see, according to who you talk to, they are still under the authority of the Khalsa. They are Sikhs that do not have initiations, and they do not have the long hair and the turban, and they do not bear the 5Ks. Now, you also have the Keshdari. So Dari means hold, so the ones who hold or maintain the hair. These are guys that have beards and turbans. Some of whom may be initiates, but not all of them. In fact, we think amongst the Keshdaris, there's only about 15% of them are actually Amritdaris, or ones who are fully initiated into the Khalsa. They do not, they have the 5Ks, maybe some of them, maybe all of them, but they definitely, Keshdari, they definitely have the long hair and will wear the turbans and the beards. So these guys, while they're not like of the Khalsa authority, still by maintaining the beard and the turban, these are the guys that we call Sardars. They still maintain the Khalsa. They still have a connection to the Khalsa. They're not in, and they're not initiates necessarily, but by their very appearance and by sort of their religiosity, they do kind of maintain the ideals of Sikhhood or Sikhness. All right, then you have the Amritdaris. These are bearers of the Amrit, bearers of the nectar, the ones who have drank the sweet of the ritual. This is about 15%. And one way to think about this is all Amritdaris will be Keshdaris that maintain the 5 Ks. However, not all Keshdaris are Amritdaris. So this is sort of like all Sikhs are Singhs, but not all Singhs are Sikhs. Just in the same way, all Amritdaris are Keshdaris, but not all Amritdaris, but not all Keshdaris are Amritdaris. I know, it's kind of confusing. Okay, so then we have this term, the Rahit. These are the codes of conduct. Now, we have this idea like they were handed down from Guru Gobind Singh, but when we look through the text, we see that no one was considered authoritative. It was only in 1950 that the specific one that we read our Khalsa Initiation ritual out of today was codified, spread around, and agreed upon. Okay, so what is this with tradition? A friend of mine always says, tradition only needs to be handed down once. So the Khalsa ritual has evolved over time, but as long as it's not exactly the same as it was done by Guru Gobind Singh, but as long as everybody says it was, and as long as it was handed down from a traditional person, then it's authoritative. Like, as long as I tell my kid to do something, even though my dad didn't tell me to do it, like, oh, all Ulris have weird pointy beards. All I have to do is hand it down once to my kid and say, this is the way we've always done it, and then it's tradition. Tradition only has to be handed down once. So the manner and appearance and customs have changed over time as well. Many will argue that rites and customs are eternal, but they are not. We're even going to see that the 5 Ks, according to Guru Gobind Singh, was probably more like 3 Ks. Go figure. So again, in religion and myth, we have to understand that we're going to argue that the rituals are eternal and forever and handed down since time eternal or since the great founder. But all we have to do is declare it, and then it works that way. Tradition only has to be handed down once. And when you think about it, this happens an awful lot in life and in culture. So how did orthodoxy develop? And here's a little bit of history. So what happened is in 1873, there was an organization called the Tat Khalsa. And what they did is they were formed in order to prevent decay amongst the Sikhs. Well, that developed. So in 1879, the name was taken up by the conservative wing of that, and they also became called the Singh Sabha, that dudes who hang out that are all named Singhs. This was more conservative in 1879. The earlier versions were called Sanatans. Now, these folks argued that Sikhism not necessarily was a part of Hinduism, but was definitely Hindu-esque, Hindu-adjacent at least. Whereas the Tat Khalsa that was more orthodox, those were the ones that said, no, we are not Hindus. Hum Hindu naye. We are not Hindus. So they really rejected any Hinduism. And when you see them, as we read through the rituals, you'll see that these more orthodox Sikhs were like, do not worship goddesses, do not worship Hindu gods, you are only a Sikh, you're only a Sikh, you're only a Sikh. And from our lesson next, we're going to actually see that there were a lot of Sikhs all over who maintained a lot of these goddess worship traditions and sort of more Hindu-like rites. And it was only in the late 19th century that the Sikh community sought to purge itself of any sort of Hindu connections. This Singh Sabha as well were the ones that, or this conservative Tat Khalsa, were the ones that said that this is the 5 Ks. The 5 Ks are the most important things. Now, so it is argued, in fact, by a lot of these folks, these more conservative folks, that Guru Gobind Singh put forth the 5 Ks so that no Sikhs could hide, that they'd be recognizable at all times. But in fact, we see from the 17th to the 19th century, there's an evolution of maintaining the 5 Ks. In fact, we'll even see that maintaining long hair, just as Guru Gobind Singh did, was something that was more ethnic than you'd think. And in fact, the Punjabis, who were the early Sikhs, were actually Scythians. They were ethnically related to southern Siberians that had headed down into India. So the long hair thing was less of a less of a new thing. So based on this argument that way they couldn't be hidden at all, but it was an ethnic thing that they had that they were able to manipulate and crystallize into a new sort of outward identity. So long hair may have come up with Nanak, but it was long connected to a group of people called the Jats, who were Scythians, who make up the majority of Hindu or of Sikhs ethnically in the Punjab. So we must remember here, and this is key, that the Khalsa is not identical to Sikhism. It's an authority within Sikhism, but it's not identical to Sikhism. Over the last 150 years, the Khalsa has argued that they are essentially what is Sikh. And they are the arbitrators of Sikhness, and they are the religious authority, but this wasn't always the case. So they really consolidated their power and authority within the last 150 years. But in fact, even now, those who are completely initiates that are Amritdaris are in the minority of. Okay. So what is this Khalsa ritual? So we described this in McLeod's work. Oh, an argument about McLeod. He's a guy from New Zealand. He's a white guy. He was one of the first people to the first Westerners to really study Sikhism, really learn Punjabi well. And there's some critique of him around, but most even the Sardars that I know are like, we don't like his historicizing our traditions, but he was a good guy. We like him. Some even call him secretly a white Sikh because his heart was so into Sikhism. Okay, so the Khalsa initiation begins, in which one bathes, and they bathe their hair and they bathe themselves, and they wear all the 5Ks, no nose rings, no any other adornments, no earrings and whatnot, and they go forth. So the initiate comes in and they're surrounded by 5 other initiates. These are the Panch Pyare. Remember when Guru Gobind Singh had the 5 guys? Here are the 5 guys again. They can be male or female. It looks like they're usually male. And these are the initiates can be male or female as well. So the Panch Pyare are, one of them is like the main initiator who sits in a heroic pose and opens the book of the Guru Granth Sahib. And one of the first things they do is they describe the faith of Sikhism to the initiate. Let me get this over here. Okay. So the Sikh faith requires you to abandon the worship of man-made objects. Instead, you should direct your love and devotion to the one supreme creator. This obligation is discharged by attending to the words of the sacred scripture, by serving the congregation and the Panch, by acting benevolently towards others, by maintaining love for the divine name, and after receiving initiation by living in accordance with the Rahat, those regulations for Sardar Sikhs, for Khalsa Sikhs. Do you gladly accept the faith? So they're told, what do you believe? Do you believe it? Here we go. So then what happens is they have a hukam, which is where they open up the text of the Guru Granth Sahib, sort of at random, and give a reading out of there that should provide some sort of insight of whatnot. You know, I love that the Sikhs have this sort of understanding of the book, that you can open it at random and learn what you need to learn for the day, and the Guru can speak through that opening of that book. The technology of the book is essential to understanding how Sikhism operates. They bring forth an iron bowl and they fill it up with water and nectar. You see the 5 guys there, and they stir it with a double-edged sword, which is the center of the Sikh Khanda. The main Sikh symbol is this double-edged sword that also has the Pirimiri idea. Also remember that Sikh symbol, the Khanda, is only found in the early 20th century. I mean, I'm not sure how we find it earlier than that, but it only became a symbol for greater Sikh identity in the 20th century. It, once again, is not eternal. Nothing is eternal. Everything is constructed and set in time. Everything is changing and in flux. Anytime somebody says we've done this exactly the same way forever, you can bet your bottom dollar there's been some changes. And when you look through the text over time, you see that things are always changing. Things are always historically minded. Things are always historically contextualized. And one of the things that I keep trying to impart to you, that religion is not internal. Religion is always set up in a time and in a place, and it changes depending on how those times and places change. And it's always going to. One of the newest things that we've happened is fundamentalism. It says it's the same as the early Christian church, but the early Christian church would not recognize it at all. And 20th century Wahhabi Islam doesn't look anything like what was going on in the time of Muhammad, even though they say, peace be upon him, even though they say that they do. All right, so they get the iron bowl, they get the iron bowl, the water, the sweets, they stir it up while chanting and singing and describing things and whatnot. Then that water is given to the initiate and it's sprinkled all over him or her. And they are, then they give the extras to the people around the community. This is also showing violation of caste because everyone's consuming liquids out of the same bowls. And then we have a new set of vows that happen. Okay, so these are the vows from the Rahit. So after the initiation ritual is done, as from today, you are born to the Guru and freed from rebirth. You are now a member of the Khalsa. Guru Gobind Singh is your spiritual father, and Sahib Kaur, the third Guru Gobind Singh's wife. Remember, Kaur means princess, Singh means lion. And your home is Anandapur, Anandapur Sahib. So this is where a lot of Sikhism got going. Because you are all children of the same father, you now have the same father, you are spiritual brothers, one with another and all others who have received this Amrit initiation. Amrit meaning the nectar, the water that they drank. You must renounce your former lineage occupation and religious affiliation. This means that you should put aside all concerns for caste status, birth, country, and religion, for you are now exclusively a member of the sublime Khalsa. You must worship God alone, spurning all other gods, goddesses, incarnations, and prophets. You must accept the 10 gurus and their teaching as your only means of deliverance. We'll see that Sikhs often, I mean, even Nanak had all sorts of other gurus and whatnot around. So this is a very specific rendering of Sikhism that is under the dominion of the Khalsa, and it's very specifically, it's the hardening of Sikh identity and Sikh even appearance. So then they have some more chanting. They have another hukam. If the name of the initiate is not one that was found in the Guru Granth Sahib, they change the first name. They also change your last name to Singh if you're a dude, lion, and Kaur if you're a lady, princess. Then they have what's called Kara Prasad. So in Kara Prasad, you see that everyone is consuming the remnants again of the iron bowl. So this is people eating from the same plate. This is people that are breaking caste, gender issues. They're eating from the same plate, and there's a vow to not eat from the same plate, however, that you'll see in some of those other vows that McLeod describes, that you can't eat from the same plate of someone who isn't another Amritdari Saint or Amritdari Sikh. So how does the ritual very much breaks caste in that people sit together, there's communal feasting with langur, they're consuming from the same vessel. It breaks away all these ideas found in the Indian system of purity and whatnot. So what about the 5Ks? We have another piece by McLeod, which I think is fascinating. And she sets out sort of a history of the 5Ks, but he argues that it's not clear. The majority of Sikhs would say that the 5Ks are thought to originate with Guru Gobind Singh, but we see things that are a little bit more complicated. Now, as a religious argument or a mythological argument, it's important to say Guru Gobind Singh set it out. He's the authority. That gives it more value. Again, when you're thinking religiously, it doesn't have to be historically valid. It just has to do work and have meaning, thinking about myth. So Guru Gobind Singh, in fact, argued that people should wear 5 specific garments, argued that you should have 5 weapons. We don't see anything in any of these texts where he argues for these 5Ks in particular. In fact, he argues for 3Ks, which is the long hair, the special underwear, and the kirpan, the weapon. Those are distinct. Guru Gobind Singh definitely said that. And even if you look back at any of those myths and whatnot, or even if you look at the video that I showed of the initial Guru Gobind Singh initiation, you'll see he doesn't actually, with the Panch Pyare come out and they're wearing specific clothes like Guru Gobind Singh, but they don't necessarily have the 5Ks. All right, so as I'd said with the hair, that was more of an ethnic thing. The Jat people that became one of the primary ethnic groups of the Sikhs who maintain long hair. McLeod will argue that hair is the most important thing that sets Sikhs apart. And he says that they screwed up. There's an interesting argument that says that they should have had the turban, but they didn't. And then he argues that there's actually a specific type of hairdress that you wear under your turban, and men and women can both wear those, and that starts with a K. I believe it's called a keshika or a keshiki. That is like it's like a third of the size of a normal turban, and that some later Sikhs say, oh no, that's the thing you really got to have, and that's so. But again, like I said, turban is not one of the 5 Ks. All right, so McLeod sets out this wonderful tentative history, and this is the thing I really like in religious studies, is when somebody takes a doctrine that's supposed to be eternal or long-standing and shows that it's different, it's evolved over time. As you write papers, show how things evolve over time, show how we thought it was this way, but it's not. Things change, and it depends on the historical context for which the thing was in. So a possible explanation for all 5 Ks appears to be as follows. Of the 5 items, one stands out conspicuously, and this is the kesh, or uncut hair. Kesh is clearly paramount and would certainly be a prominent feature in any Sikh apparel devised by Guru Gobind Singh. Devout Sikhs of the late 19th centuries were aware of the importance of the figure 5 and sought to bracket kesh in a group of 5 items that would enjoy a primary ranking for all loyal followers of the Sikh discipline. Kesh begins with a K, and so the other 4 remaining items must also begin with that same letter. As we've noted, it was not until Sumar Singh, who was a much later guy, I think he was in the 1920s, that all these 5 items occurred. The Tat Khalsa recognized the importance of constructing a consistent pattern, and the 5 Ks were thereafter written into the Rahit. Remember the Rahit that all of the Khalsa rituals is from, it was codified in 1950. Features that failed to begin with the letter K were omitted, an important example being words for turban. One would think turban would be there, isn't. So here's the reason why it wasn't. It didn't have a K, and kesh was the main one, kesh starting with K. Only with the sectarian groups, notably the Akhand Kirtani Jata, has this particular dilemma been resolved by insisting that kesh should be replaced by keshki. Instead of the long hair in particular, it's a specific under turban. And a lot of my Sardar friends have said, I'm like, the turban, that's sick? And they're like, no, it's this thing underneath. That's the really important thing. But even there, that doesn't go back to Guru Gobind Singh. It doesn't even go back to the earliest iterations of the 5 Ks in the 19th century, the keshki. So how is this Khalsa about initiation? Following Van Gennep and Turner, as I said, we have in the preliminary state, a person is raised as Sikh, they're raised in Sikh culture in their family, or they've decided to be initiated. The person should know Punjabi or at least Gurmukhi. There is, in fact, a regulation after one has been initiated that they need to read every day the scriptures in the Gurmukhi. Now, Gurmukhi, remember, Guru's mouth. That's the script of Punjabi that was designed by one of the Sikh gurus. So in the liminal state, they're taken into a private place where they're only surrounded by initiates. It could just be the 5 Panch Pyare and them, or it could be a whole community. They take vows, and they're instructed in understanding their vows, and they change their names. They've been ritually reborn, and they're reborn as supposedly their father is Guru Gobind Singh. And their mother is one of his wives, so Kaur or Singh. Finally, you have the post-liminal state, in which one moves forward as an Amritdari and maintains the 5 Ks. They function as religious authorities for all Sikhs now, because the Khalsa has become a bigger deal than it was previously. And as a buddy of mine who's a Sardar, well, his wife said to me, she was like, yeah, Sonny always says that once you take the initiation, then there's no fun anymore. No intoxicants, no premarital sex, no consuming meat that hasn't been killed, that's been killed in a halal way is actually what he's getting at. Specific dietary stuff is kind of vague, but it's pretty much to set them apart from Muslims. But it's just like, he's like, there's no fun anymore. But they're living fully as an adult, as a full man, as a full woman, and as a representative of the Khalsa and of Sikh ideals. So as we come to an end, I wanted to ask you about initiation and the Khalsa. And I want you to think about, what are some other initiations and rites of passage that you can think of in other religions or even in your own life? And what does it mean to change your name and to make vows? Like, I know when I first took my first initiation into Buddhism, I took refuge, which is basically, I say, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And this Tibetan Lama gave me a new name that I lost somewhere. And even though I know Tibetan, I can't, I'd read it then in an English transliteration, but I think it was Tupten Chuge, which means he who is the shining king of the Dharma. But you get a new name. It's your refuge name. So in a lot of these ritual initiations, like when I was initiated into a group called the Ecclesiastica Gnostica Catholica, they asked, what name will you be initiated in? And I went, Aaron Michael Ulrich. I'm good with that. Like, okay. And then I turned to my next, and this woman that I took this same initiation with said, Dancer in the Sun. Okay, I still think that's ridiculous. But we're like, all right, Dancer in the Sun, whatever, next person. But the idea is your name changes when you join this church. So what does it mean that your name changes? What is that status of a person that's different at that point? And finally, how is tradition historical and how does it change? This Khalsa initiation, we know what it looks like in 1950 because that was the first time that it was codified and everybody started doing it the same way. We know they would have been doing it all sorts of different ways before because there wasn't a unified text. There wasn't a unified way of doing it. I'm sure that at the earliest stage, there was the iron bowl, the mixing of the nectar, and the sharing of the nectar. But all the other stuff around it that you read about in McLeod's description of the initiation, a lot of that wouldn't have been there, or it would have been different, or there would have been something else there. So these rituals change over time. You know, it's not like, say, the Catholic Mass, but even the Catholic Mass has changed since the 1960s when they started doing it in English. And they did the ad orientem, where the minister turns or the priest turns around and faces the congregation instead of doing the mass with their back to the person. And there was a scholar that I heard one time said, I don't know, the minute they turn the priest around, it looks like a goddamn cooking show up there. It's Julia Child. I told this to a priest buddy of mine. He's like, that is so funny. He's like, now when I'm up there doing it, I do imagine I'm on a cooking show. That amuses me. All right, so that's our lesson for today. Enjoy yourselves. Take care of each other. Be well out there. Bye-bye now.